What is up, Trailblazers? Welcome back to the channel if you've been here before, and if not, welcome to the channel. Today we are doing a Dan Heng kit guide and discussion. I've been taking some feedback from some of the comments I get and adjusted my formula, so let's get things kicked into full gear with my hopefully new and improved recipe for kit guide and discussions. So we want to be playing Dan Heng to his full potential. He is a top tier DPS in my opinion. Let's put some money where my mouth is on that one. I haven't personally pulled for Yanqing and I'm saving for a support, so I also haven't pulled for Zele, so he is my main DPS and I just think he is so strong with some investment, and let's break that down. As always, we will be covering his full kit, including traces, and a general summary at the end with some pros and cons. As part of my new formula, we'll be doing his eidolons, and we're also going to be doing build, aka light cones and relics, as well as some team building. All sections will be time stamps below. As always, if you do like the content, then please feel free to leave a like and or a comment. Feed the algorithm because it's hungry, and if you don't like it, I don't know, just comment that you hate me because engagement is engagement. No, just subscribe. Anyway, with all that said, let's get into it. Starting with his kit. So his basic attack, Cloud, Lancer R, Northwind. It's your basic attack. It doesn't use a skill point. There's never really much to say on here. 20 energy regen on it. Basic attack. For his skill, Cloud, Lancer R, Torrent, it is a single target wind attack. At level 13, it will do 260% of Dan Heng's attack. If it crits, there is a 100% base chance to reduce the target's speed by 12% for 2 turns. All in all, it's a decent modifier, and the ability to inflict slow gives him some nice utility for a skill. For his ult, it's a 100 energy cost, it is your wind nuke, and it deals wind damage equal to 400% of Dan Heng's attack to a single enemy at level 13. It is a nice chunking ability, and if the enemy is slowed, his ultimate damage multiplier increases by another 120% at level 13. This is additive, so the multiplier will be one whole figure, i.e. 520% at level 13, before taking into account any stats or your state of play. And obviously, this slow can be from the skill itself, so some nice synergy with his skill. Dan Heng's technique, Splitting Spearhead, he increases his own attack by 40% for 3 turns at the start of the battle, but it also doesn't start the fight itself, so you can use this to increase his attack and then proc a different team member's tech to start a fight and break some weaknesses if need be. Finally, we have his talent. When Dan Heng is the target of an ally's ability, his next attack's wind res pen will increase by 36%. This effect can be triggered after 2 turns of being activated. And when I say an ally's ability that targets him, essentially it needs to be some type of actual aimed ability, such as a March 7th shield or an AoE ability, thinking things along the lines of like a AoE heal from Natasha's ult or an AoE Asta buff. It doesn't work if you use a bouncing ability essentially. For traces, we have the Hidden Dragon, which is when his HP is lower than 50%. It will reduce the chance of him being targeted by enemies, basically some self-peel. His second trace, Faster Than Light, after launching an attack, there is a 50% fixed chance to increase his own speed by 20% for 2 turns. And thirdly, his third trace, High Gale, basic attack deals 40% more damage to slowed enemies, if you remember that we do have some slow in his skill. All in all, looking at his kit, you can see that I have a few points. His basic attack has a 20 energy regen rate with his skill rounding off at 30. So knowing that he has a 100 energy cost ultimate, you're looking at 4 to 5 non% scaled or buffed turns in terms of energy to actually get his ultimate off. Obviously, if you are looking to push maximum usage of his ult more frequently, you can place him next to your shield or taunter so that he gets hit by cleave damage, or you can start to build teams around this by giving on some like passive energy, such as something from a Tingyun, but altogether, yeah, his ult is going to be at least more than 3 turns to use. His talent likes him to be paired with a team member that has targeting ally skills, but this doesn't need to be a buff to trigger, so like I said earlier, something like a March 7th shield will work if you want that res pen. To get the most out of his kit, you do want to make the most out of the slow on his skill, but bear in mind that the skill itself does hit multiple times, so you do have multiple attempts to actually proc it. It does look like a low percent base at first, but like I say, his skill hits, I think it's like 3 to 4 times, so yeah, you have a good chance of getting off his skill, slowing the enemy, and then you would line up his ultimate. This brings me on to the last point about him, is that basically he does have a neutral skill costing rotation, which would be skill, normal attack, etc., lining up so that you have a slow on the enemy, then going into an ult, and if possible using an ally's buff to get wind res pen so that his ultimate is dealing a maximum damage output. But bear in mind that if you are running him on a skill into normal attack rotation for minimum skill point investment, you will be doing less damage output overall. I don't want to start waxing lyrical about rotations or anything like that. It's just something to bear in mind that if you want to get the maximum out of him, hit his ult after an ally buff or a targeted effect, and then follow in using a skill or slowing the enemy itself. So with kit covered, let's go into eidolons, as they are an enhancement to his kit. By the way, if you don't know, the month of May right now, you can actually purchase one of his eidolons from Starlight Exchange Store for 140 Starlight. So something to bear in mind if you want to all in Dan Heng, as eidolons for a 4-star character who's not on rate up can be quite difficult to obtain, so maybe worth your investment. Eidolons themselves. E1, the higher you fly, the harder you fall. Basically, when a target enemy's HP percent is greater than or equal to 50%, his crit rate will increase by 12%. The crit is good, but just bear in mind it is geared towards being active at the start of the fight, and you will lose this value towards the end of the fight. E2, Quell the Venom Octet, a really good one on paper as it reduces his talent cooldown by 1 turn so he can get his wind res penning quicker, but the problem with this is that it can make it even harder to actually align your ultimate with the uptime for it. So if you want to get the max out of this eidolon, you're going to want to run some third-party sources of hard energy regen from like a Tingyun ultimate to make sure that you always have that wind res pen aligned with then your big damage dealing like your ult. His E2 is +2 to his skill and +1 to his basic attack. His E4, Roaring Dragon and Soaring Sun, when he defeats an enemy with his ult, he will advance forward by 100%, so he's going to immediately act on the next turn. Bear that in mind later when we think about relics. His E5, ult +2 and talent +2, so his damage increased to his main nuke, and then his E6, an additional 8% slow speed reduction on his skill. Overall, the damage increase sits in his E1 to E2 and then his E4, but none of these eidolons are like a massive power spike or anything. He will function really well without them. They are just nice optionals if he is a rate up in my opinion. The light cones, okay, so standardizing DPS light cones can be a bit difficult, as swapping one out gives you a whole host of different crit rates and damages to factor in that will make one weapon appear stronger than another. To try and combat this, I'm going to be taking a look at some of the light cones and running them each through what the average amount of damage can be done by Dan Heng with base 50% crit rate and 100% crit damage, so quite low numbers to achieve on his relics. We are taking average damage over max damage to consolidate the crit discrepancies from something like swordplay, which gives no crit to give you a more general sense of how each light cone performs, but these in and of themselves are build dependent on your Dan Heng, and I will talk to that, especially with something like Cruise of the Stellar Sea in a moment. As always, I'm going to start with 3 stars and move up to 5 stars as the game's a little early right now still, and while you will get massive damage boosts on something like a 5-star light cone, I don't think they're necessary. For 3-star, arrows is your safe bet 3-star option, just a basic pickup. At the beginning of the battle, increase the wearer's crit rate by 12% for 3 turns, and it has 317 raw attack in. Again, gearing him up to the start of the fight though, so a bit limited with this light cone. 4 stars gets a little bit interesting because I'm going to talk about 4 different light cones. On raw damage alone, I do have swordplay performing better overall in raw numbers, but the main problem with swordplay is that it has 0 crit stats on it, so you'll really want to have your crit stats effectively managed before considering this as an option, which really isn't an easy feat to do. I will say one thing though, there is this dispelling effect on switching target. I actually wouldn't worry about this too much, basically because swordplay stacks are on hit rather than per ability used, so your skill can get multiple procs in, making it so that the target change isn't all that detrimental to running this light cone, and running this light cone is more about, like I say, having a good crit rate to damage ratio. For a more well-rounded option, you do have Return to Darkness, which does have lower damage output overall, but comes with hit crit rate and a chance to dispel an enemy buff on crit hit. The base chance looks low, but the utility is proccable on hit, not ability given. We've established he can hit multiple times per turn, so you might find that you get more usage out of this than you would imagine. Another 4-star one that I really like is Only Silence Remains. It's in the middle ground of the 2 mentioned. It gives more consistent damage, some crit rate, and some damage boost, plus it has a picture of him on it. This is a Stellar Warp light cone though, so you'd have to summon it to get the most use out of kind of superimposing it, for example. Finally, there is a free-to-play 4-star option, which is River Flows. It's a really good 4-star pick. It's coming through quite low for me on the damage side because you lose a lot of the ability when you get hit, and then not losing that buff is just a nightmare to try and manage. However, if you do have something like a Gapard that can keep a good AoE shield up so that your Dan Heng isn't getting randomly targeted or hit by AoE/cleave, then this can be a really reliable weapon on him, so definitely something to consider if you do have a Gapard handy. Then for 5 stars, I'm going to cover Cruising C first, the Herta Lycone, because I've put 2 numbers in. Basically, it does have higher base attack than most of your 4 stars and will perform better if you can get those effects off. So it is a really decent pickup, but you can see the discrepancy is absolutely huge on this one, and it will lose a lot of its value if you're not able to proc both effects. Additionally, this Lycone has very high crit rate, so you'll probably want to play around with your relic stats a lot more with this one, as you may find that in some comps, crit damage is your better chest piece due to all the crit rate on this Lycone, and so it becomes a bit more of a, managing numbers game. Finally, just for his strongest Lycone overall, there is In the Night. It's your max damage boost. This is a gacha weapon, but it's worth covering because it's just a great damage boost on him. And let's say if you did pull for this and Zele, it's not as if you have to permanently glue it to Zele. If you have it spare, you can raise Dan Heng for those enemies that are not resistant to wind, but are resistant to quantum, and you want to use him, and then you can just swap the weapon over onto him. With Lycones covered, let's flush out his build with some relics. Okay, so for his main relic set, we are going to run Eagle of Twilight Lane. You get wind damage 10% and a 25% advance forward after using his ultimate. Now, do know if you have Eidolon 4 and his ult defeats an enemy, then you're already at 100% advance forward, and so you might want to consider running a 2-piece attack percent bonus like Musketeer, because obviously you can get higher attack stats out of that, and then you're not kind of double risking down multiple stacks of advance forward, because at the end of the day, if you're on E4 and you time it right, and most of your damage will come out of his ultimate, then you're going to get the 100% advance forward anyway. Just something to consider about if you're kind of min-maxing your Dan Heng. You might be better off with a 2-piece, but for most of us who have a low Eidolon, just go 4-piece on this one. I'm using 4-piece right now and it's great. For playing out ornaments, we are just going to run the Space Sealing Station. It's 2 12% attack bonuses. Dan Heng has a base 110 speed, so you're not even going to struggle to proc the second effect. For main stats, with all DPS, you want to work towards a golden ratio of 1 crit rate to 2 crit damage, so that you are reasonably getting damage from your crit strikes, and so that you're also hitting them often enough. I'd usually always aim for a minimum of 50% crit rate as a beginner build to make sure that you're proccing crits on your ultimate, especially more often than you're not. Then, as you're farming, work towards a higher crit rate as possible, bearing in mind not to overcap with things extra crit rate on your Lycones. As such, for relic main stats, you're normally going to see crit rate on chest, speed on feet, wind damage bonus on the sphere, and attack percent on the link rope. Depending on your ratio and Lycones, you may find yourself swapping your crit rate chest piece for a crit damage chest piece with good substats. There are some people who will also consider attack percentage on the feet. This is basically because if he is slower, he is going to be less skill point hungry and easier to manage your talents on him. So typically when you find speed on feet, it's because you're running him more as a hyper carry who has enough team skill point synergy to constantly be throwing out his skills. With his build covered, let's talk about team synergy. And I've said this before, I don't like doing team comps too much, as I think the team comps always need to factor in things like the content itself, and I did cover this in my team building guide where I ran Dan Heng as the main DPS for all of those combinations. But with that said, we do have some good team synergy picks for Dan Heng, so let's talk about them. Focusing on team comp, you do have your free-to-play main focus that we're going to start with as our building block. So Dan Heng main DPS, Saval sub DPS, Natasha as your heal, and then Fire MC on March 7th as your shielder. This team comp gives your main staying power, where Dan Heng thrives as a main DPS, and so he's focusing on getting as many skills off as possible. Saval is here to act as sub DPS, and so she'll be rotating the NA into skill, into NA into skill, to avoid draining the skill points from your skill bank and letting Dan Heng get the most amount of damage possible. Additionally, as an erudition character, she's going to give you some AoE impact damage, so feel free to swap her out with any other AoE damage dealer that you have. Natasha, standard heals, utilizing ult for AoE heals and using her E, which can also remove a debuff and do more targeted heals, including proccing his talent. And then Fire MC is slotted here because they give you AoE shields to keep you alive and also can proc Dan Heng's ally targeted talent. But like I say, you can slot March here, which is how I actually run my team comps, because she also has a debuff removal in her E, so it makes kind of Natasha's debuff removal less demanding if you have that extra flex. Alternatively, you can forego a sub DPS for someone like Ting Yun in a more hypercarry fixed slot. This is going to be a very skill point hungry team because you can no longer kind of use Saval just to kind of throw out normal attacks, and instead with Ting Yun though, you are getting a huge boost to your attack and overall damage output from her skill, and then with her ult, you're getting a flat 50 energy, so half of its ult restoration, and a damage increase of 50%. So you can see by removing a sub DPS, we're actually focusing more on Dan Heng being the sole damage dealer, so it can be quite restrictive, but it also gets your Dan Heng doing the big numbers. You can derive some strong team synergy as well when we start to move things up in the gacha tier by using someone like Welt as a form of support instead. So he is a 5-star Nihility imaginary damage dealer. He's replacing Saval or Ting Yun here, mostly also because he can apply a more consistent slow on the enemies, so he's going to help Dan Heng get the most out of his kit a lot more flexibly, but in addition he can deal some damage himself basically. For other gacha options, something to consider is if you're going to swap Gepard in as your shielder, then as I said earlier, you might get some stronger use out of River Flows in Spring, and so it could be worth farming the Echo of Wall / Forgotten Hall for max leveling that free-to-play light cone on Dan Heng, because he's less likely to take damage. Finally, if you're running Bailu as your healer instead of Natasha, just remember that the bouncing element of her skill will not proc Dan Heng's target dependent talent, so while you are able to passive heal with her, you'll still need to find a way of getting his wind res pen in. Okay, so with team synergy done, I would, like I say, recommend playing around with it or even look at my team building guide, thanks, but that's kind of how I run my team with Dan Heng. With everything covered, you are now on your way to being the best possible Dan Heng main you can be, so I'm just going to very quickly summarize everything we've learned on Mr. Silent but Deadly. Starting with a pros and cons table. Basically for pros, he is free up to E1 right now, so that's good for getting an additional eidolon from him, and he can deal high amounts of damage, and the modifiers on his ult are actually exceptionally high. He's also a good source of roll divisor. He can take advantage of inflicting slow through his kit, and he can also use some buff removal through the Return to Darkness light cone if you want to vary up your team comps. Additionally, he has res pen in his kit, which is a really great ability to have. And then onto cons, he does need a targeted support to help proc his talent. He can be skill point hungry for max damage output, which will lead us on to that if you are playing his hyper carry style, he prefers to consume most of your skill points, and so he can be quite skill point hungry to get the most out of him. He's quite a selfish damage dealer. As a selfish damage dealer of the hunt path, this also means that you are going to be focusing on single target damage, and so he's not going to play very well in mob fights. And that's everything I have for you on our favourite win boy. I'm glad to be back doing my guides. I hope you enjoyed this one, and if you did, please feel free to leave a like or a sub, and join me for the next one. Thanks, goodbye.